Shalom. It's Gabriel. Um, it's 1:22 in the morning. I'm awake, I'm bored, and I'm surprisingly feeling pretty good. I wanted to address, so I got a couple different questions in my email today, and I want to address them kind of all at once. So there's a claim here being proffered. Jews should accept Jesus as the Messiah because Josephus, the first century Roman Jewish historian, tells us that he was the Messiah. That's a pretty bold claim. I understand why some people think this way. There is a little bit of background. Josephus, being a Roman Jewish historian, lived in the first century, obviously. He participated in the Roman Jewish wars. He switched sides. I'm giving you a very short Reader's Digest version. He's a very, very fascinating man, very educated, very learned. And he wrote a history of the Jewish people. He wrote it for a Roman audience. He wrote it in the latter part of the first century in Rome. He was commissioned by the Vespasian dynasty the Flavian dynasty to write it, rather. And one passage that exists in the writings of Josephus, and this is it. This is the Slavonic version, in Book 18, Chapter 3. About this time there lived Jesus, a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man. For he was one who performed surprising deeds and was a teacher of such people as accept the truth gladly. He won over many Jews and many of the Greeks. He was the Christ, and when upon the accusation of the principal men among us, Pilate had condemned him to a cross. Those who had first come to love him did not cease. He appeared to them, spending a third day restored to life. For the prophets of God had foretold these things and 1,000 other marvels about him. And the tribe of the Christians, so called after them, has to this day not disappeared. Okay, so there's a massive problem taking this verse at face value from Josephus. Why? It has nothing to do with the surrounding verses around it. Very interesting that Josephus allegedly writes this verse almost as if he himself is a believer in Jesus, and yet this is the only thing he really writes about him. And he spends close to 40 different paragraphs, 40 different chapters, detailing the debauchery of King Herod the Great, but he spends just this 2-paragraph area about Jesus. That doesn't make any sense, and it doesn't blend in well with the surrounding passages. Furthermore, we know that Josephus was a very big mocker of messianic claimants in the first century. Jesus was an archetype. He was not particularly unique. There are many people claiming to be the Messiah, and Josephus seems to have more or less hated all of them. Even more interesting is, Josephus was a popular writer, and it's very clear to us from the writings of the church fathers that they were aware of his work and they were familiar with his works. It's very interesting that we don't really see this passage mentioned at all until the 3rd century. That's right, especially the church father Origen. Origen writes that that Josephus did not consider Jesus to be the Christ. It's kind of a contradiction there, and he doesn't mention this passage at all. The first time an external source mentions this passage, it's by the church father Eusebius, and given what we know about his tendency to embellish or even change the meaning of other documents, it's not that surprising, and it's also not that reliable. So that leaves us with a couple different options. And by the way, this is not the only mention of Jesus in Josephus. Josephus mentions many Jesuses. It's a very common name. But there's another passage in Book 20 about James, the brother of Jesus. Now that, I think, has a little bit more of a ring to authenticity. And there's also a mention of John the Baptist, which I think is also probably authentic. So what does that leave us with? I think that leaves us with basically 3 options. One, the passage in Josephus that is cited, which is called the Testimonium Flavianum, is entirely accurate. And it's describing the reality as Josephus wrote it and believed it. I've already kind of pointed out why that's problematic, seeing as how he doesn't seem to have mentioned this anywhere else, and his entire life he seems to be a practicing Jew, not a Christian. Interestingly enough, Josephus was one of the first people to write a philosophical defense of Judaism as a faith. He wrote another book called Contra Appion, which means against Appion, who was a pagan scholar. And he never in this book mentions that he believes in Jesus or anything like that. So I think we can kind of put option one to rest. The second option is that it's entirely made up. It was added by a church father, possibly Eusebius, hundreds of years later. Now, this was the dominant position among most literary scholars up until the 1970s. They thought it was entirely falsified. However, something else came to light not that long ago. They've discovered an Arabic version of Josephus and a Syriac version of Josephus that was not kept exclusively by the church. And while the passage exists in those writings, it's not quite the same as it is in the Greek Josephus that was preserved by the church. In fact, it's actually pretty remarkably different. They've kind of reconstructed what the original, and so basically two options that we've explored so far: either it's entirely authentic, which is a no-go, or it's entirely false and was added by a church father years later. That's still possible, but I think the third option is the most likely one. The third option being that Josephus likely wrote something about Jesus of Nazareth, and it was later added to by church fathers. And the reason why this is the scholarly consensus today is because of they've discovered other versions of Josephus, and they've reconstructed what that passage more likely than not probably read like, which is as follows. And now there was at about this time Jesus, a wise man, for he was a doer of startling deeds, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. And he gained a following among many Jews and many of Greek origin. And when Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at first did not forsake him. And the tribe of Christians so named for him are not extinct at this day. So basically, the original passage written by Josephus probably did not make any Christological claims, did not make any messianic claims, did not make any supernatural claims. And just seems like, hey, there was this guy who claimed this, or he had an interesting thing going on with him, and then he was executed, basically. And so based on the Arabic and the Syriac versions of Josephus, it is now the scholarly consensus that the passage is partly authentic and partly interpolated and partly altered. So where does that leave us? Really at base one, Josephus was not alive during Jesus' lifetime. He was born only a couple years later after Jesus is supposed to have lived. Now, I want to give out a little caveat here. I believe Jesus of Nazareth existed. I think this kind of internet trend of what's called Christ mythicism, this idea that Jesus of Nazareth is just a mythological, fictional character, is borderline nonsense. There are many other people in history that are accepted to exist at face value without having the best documentation for their existence. But while it's true that this evidence for the life of Jesus comes decades after his life, that shouldn't mean on the face of things that he didn't exist. That's actually pretty ridiculous. Now, that's not to say I accept the Christian beliefs about him. I don't. Still a Jew, still a good Jew. Good, quote unquote. But I don't think you can credibly use Josephus as proof or even evidence of Jesus or any of the claims that the church makes about him. And even the early church fathers wrote explicitly that Josephus does not appear to have believed in Jesus. So apparently they were familiar with more original manuscripts that either didn't contain this verse or contained a very different telling of this verse. That being said, I mean, I'm not exactly sure how far I can extend upon that. I mean, one contemporary Jewish scholar who was a contemporary of Jesus of Nazareth and who mentions people like Pontius Pilate is Philo Judaeus. He actually lived pretty much in the same time frame as Jesus, and he never wrote about him. Now, again, that doesn't mean he didn't exist, but he obviously didn't have the following or the prestige in life that he would have after his death. That makes sense after a certain point. Most people that history remembers doesn't really remember them until after they're gone. I think probably the most historically accurate records of Jesus's life and teachings are probably, if you can sift out the supernatural claims, are found in what are called the Synoptic Gospels and possibly the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, is where you're going to find probably the most authentic teachings and details about his life. Because not only their antiquity is, especially in the case of certain Gospels, they seem to be, if not written by eyewitness persons themselves, they seem to have been written by someone who spoke to eyewitnesses of certain things, certain teachings, certain events. Those are probably your best evidence for Jesus of Nazareth. Josephus really does not offer any proof or evidence for Jesus of Nazareth in any meaningful sense. Josephus was a fantastic historian. I have very mixed feelings about him because if you think about it, he's kind of like our Benedict Arnold. He switched sides and fought for the Romans and later wrote histories of their wars against us. And all the writings he wrote, I think there's only 5 or 6 that we still have. He wrote Antiquities of the Jews, which is an entirely a Jewish history written for a Roman audience, which is fascinating. And by the way, I encourage everyone who watches this to get a copy of the works of Josephus. You can find all of them in a nice hardbound copy for about $20 or $30. And if you're interested in that time period or the era of the first century, I'd certainly suggest reading them. They're fascinating and remarkable detail. So there's the Antiquities of the Jews. There's the Jewish Wars, which is, the emperor basically commissioned him to write a history of the wars between Jews and Romans, from a Roman perspective. There was a history written from a Jewish perspective, written by a man named Justus of Tiberias. But unfortunately, the Romans destroyed all of his writings, and we don't have them today. So all we really have is Josephus. What else did he write? He wrote an autobiography about his own life, which is also very interesting. And he also wrote Contra Appian, which is, again, it was a defense of Judaism against a pagan scholar named Appian, who didn't like us so well. And there's a 5th one. I know there's a 5th one, but I can't remember what it is. It will come to me at some point, I'm sure. One thing you have to keep in mind with Josephus, historians in the first century did not write with the same objectivity as historians are supposed to write today. History was looked at as a form of entertainment, so if you could embellish a little bit to make it either funny or more dramatic, that was encouraged by the Romans. So there is some objectivity issues, and they also take into account the fact that the man was basically a turncoat. He fought for his own people, and then he very kind of underhandedly switched sides and started working for the Romans. He lived the rest of his life in the Flavian compound in Rome. He was basically an adopted member of the imperial family. Very prestigious. He got a pension from them the rest of his life. He was protected by them. So that's kind of something you have to keep in mind. He's not exactly an objective source, but archaeology has proven him to give very accurate descriptions of the city, Jerusalem in the first century. Archaeologists can basically, based off of Josephus, can basically know exactly where to dig to find fortifications, to find palaces. So he mapped out everything extremely well. So in that regards, and in that regards, he's very valuable. And in other regards, he's very valuable in that he describes what Jews believed, what they thought, and how they lived in the first century, which is fascinating into itself. If there are any follow-up questions, I encourage you to go ahead and send me a message or leave a comment. I hope to see you next time. All right, bye-bye.